Welcome everybody to the SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast, and this time we'll be having a look on how to call enterprise applications securely from SharePoint Framework. And this is something which got slightly changed or evolved as part of SharePoint Framework version 1.4.1, and within this webcast we'll kind of a deep dive on those changes and how the process will look like in detail. My name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a Senior Program Manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me today as the person who's going to do the live demo is Waldek. So Waldek, will you do the quick intros as well?
Absolutely. Hi everybody, my name is Waldek Mastikas. I work at Rancor. I am Office Development MVP, and today we will talk about calling enterprise applications securely from SharePoint Framework.
Indeed. So let's actually have a look directly on the logical architecture on what are we looking into. So the whole point of this model is that the key point in this key challenge in the past in the SharePoint Online has been that how would I be able to successfully or easily securely call a custom web API or an application or an API hosted, for example, in Microsoft Azure, well, typically in Microsoft Azure. These applications are your enterprise applications. They could be, that API could be a root, or it could have a root even calling to on-premises or your LOB systems within wherever they are being hosted. And quite often you want to present some kind of data from your LOB systems in SharePoint Online. And this new model, which we introduced as part of the SharePoint Framework 1.4.1, will make implementation of these kind of designs much more easier. So what you need to do and to make these things work is that as a tenant administrator, you basically need to configure and control what are the permissions for SharePoint Framework and the SharePoint Framework implementations to actually have when it's calling, or what are the API permissions what the SharePoint Framework can actually call. And the tenant administrator can configure this in the Azure AD. So there is a provisioned an application which the tenant administrator is basically configuring within Azure AD for every single Office 365 tenant. Now, when you then implement a SharePoint Framework web part which wants to call that custom web API or enterprise application, that client-side web part or an extension, so to say, can then request an access token from the Azure AD or Azure Active Directory, given those permissions what the tenant administrator has given, and then with that access token, the client-side web part or SPFX can actually call that custom web API, which is hosted in Azure in this case. Anything you want to add here, actually, directly, Waldek?
Yeah. So the only thing that I want to ask. So, from what I understood is that the web part on a page reaches out to AAD to get a token. But what role does play the SharePoint Online client in that flow?
So the SharePoint Online client, which is mentioned in the slide, this is pre-provisioned application like mentioned, and this is the Azure AD enterprise application, which we pre-provisioned for all of the tenants. So whenever the client-side web part is then planning to call a custom, let's say a Microsoft Graph or a custom web API, that SharePoint Online client is the one where we control the permissions. So is the SharePoint Framework application or SharePoint Framework code capable of calling that custom web API? Is it permission? Does it have a permission to do that operation which it's planning to now do?
Right. So if I understand that correctly, the web part on a page retrieves access token to the enterprise app on behalf of the SharePoint Online client app, right? So that's the, let's say, the filter or funnel that channels these requests.
That is correct. Yes, indeed.
Gotcha.
So, and there's basically what happens here is that, like mentioned, the tenant administrator is able to control using that application, which is in Azure AD, what are the permissions in general for SharePoint Framework to call within this particular tenant. So, is it capable of calling which graph APIs? It's capable of calling which third-party web API. You grant those permissions for the SharePoint Online client. And obviously we'll show this one in the practice in the demo as well, just to clarify how the flow actually works. But basically this way, the SharePoint framework, the tenant administrator controls which are the operations, what the SharePoint framework customization can do within a tenant level. And this is then guaranteeing that there's no violation of the code. Because by default, if we actually jump into the following slide, and on the first bullet point of this one, by default, even though you might have a customer APIs or enterprise APIs in the same Azure AD tenant, you do not have permissions to call them from a SharePoint framework. So there's no kind of automatic way of doing this. And this really relates on how the Azure AD actually works and the enterprise applications work within the Azure AD side. And then, like mentioned on the previous slide as well, the tenant administrator is the one who controls these permissions. So it's not about the developer being, in quotes, clever enough to know where the web API is. So even though the developer would know where the web API is, if it has been secured, like it should be secured with an Azure AD, the SPFX code cannot call that unless the tenant administrator has granted the needed permissions for calling the API. These granted permissions for API apply to all customizations running in the tenant. So when you're granting permissions for SharePoint Framework to call an API, it's not about the SharePoint Framework solution itself. It's about all of the solutions and customizations within a tenant. And we'll show this one in practice as well. But so there's no, let's say, isolation of these permissions per SharePoint Framework solution or a SharePoint Framework web part or an extension. The permissions are same for all of the solutions which have been deployed in a tenant. Also, if you're hosting the third-party API or your enterprise API in a different Azure AD tenant, then your Office 365 tenant, then you need to do some additional, let's say, configurations and settings. And this is where you need to have the admin consent because that API has to be then multi-tenant aware. So the tenant where your SharePoint Framework solutions are running with the Office 365 tenant will need to trust the tenant, or there has to be the admin consent to call the API in another tenant, which is hosting then the third-party API. Was that way too complicated way of putting that?
No, I mean, that's the way it works, right? But I guess it is important for us to underline the fact that, as you said, by default, even though an API exists in the same AD as your tenant, it is by default not exposed. Why? Because you may have more APIs that you want to make available to all scripts that run inside a tenant. So it's always explicit tenant admin choice to make an API available to scripts that run on pages. Right? So it's not, yes. There is no implicit grant like that thing exists in the same AD, so everybody is free to exit. This is not the case.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. This was a relatively quick intro on the process and the model, but I think if you haven't actually read anything about this one from our official documentation, which is by the way obviously referenced in the video notes as well, let's have a live demo on this one and clarify the steps and one step at a time, which we went through in the logical architecture design diagram as well. So while that's going to show you the setup with a application API or third party, let's say in quotes, a third party web API, and then how do we call that? First of all, how do we grant the permissions to be able to call that? And also, how do we call that from a SharePoint framework in a secure way? So let's have this live demo and come back on the slides and close up the webcast.
All right. Let's take a look how you would call a enterprise API secured with AAD from SPFX web part. So here I have an enterprise API that I implemented as an Azure function. In here, I have an endpoint that shows me orders. If I were to call this API in browser just to see if it works, I can go to orders, the endpoint, get the URL, copy it, and enter it in browser here. And as you can see here, I get error, but that's related to the fact that the browser cannot really show the data in XML format. So instead, let me issue the same call, but then get the data in JSON. So for that, the first part that I need to have is a cookie, because that API is not available to anonymous. So if I would just call it, I would have unauthorized error because I am not logged in, right? And here, the reason that I can call it is because I am already in browser, because I am already in Azure, right? So that's why I can already call the API, and I only show error because the browser cannot show the data in XML. So first, let me get cookie, and I can get that from developer tools. So now if I refresh the page, here I will see the request to the API, and from here I can get cookie. So I can copy all of that. And here, let me grab that, and let me issue a call in VS Code. So let me just do all of that, and issue exactly the same call to the same URL, get request. Let me issue it. And now we can see that I actually get the data back. So the API works. So that's the first part. The API is not available to anonymous. I actually enabled an AAD app to protect the access to it, which you would probably do in your enterprise as well. So here, if we go to auth, you can actually see that AAD is indeed enabled for this function app. And here you can get the details about the AAD app that is used to secure this endpoint. And here you only see the ID of the app. But if we go to Azure AD, in there we'll be able to see also the app's name. And these are the important pieces that you have to know in order for you to be able to access that API in your SharePoint Framework web part. Because, as we said, these APIs, even though they live already in Azure, they are not available by default to you. You cannot just access them. First, you have to request access to it, and for that, you actually need to know either the ID or the name of the app. So if we go back to project, here, we have a file called package solution JSON. Let me open it here. And in there, to request access to an API, you add a new section named Web API Permission Requests. And whatever you put in here, that will be surfaced in tenant, and then tenant admin will be able to approve that or not. And there are 2 bits for each entry, right? So for each API that you want to access, you have to include 2 pieces of info. First is the resource, and this can be either the name or ID of the app. Personally, I like the name because it's easier to remember. It's clearer now, but also over a week or a month, I will always know which AAD app I need to access. And then scope. Usually in an enterprise API, that will be just access, like here. But you might have an API that distinguishes between read and write. So depending how you would like to interact with the API, you would include the scopes accordingly, the way they are defined in the AAD app used to protect the endpoint. So that's first. Next, in web part, we actually have to issue a call, and we do that using the new AadHttpClient, and you can load that from the @Microsoft/ASP-HTTP package, right? Because that's not available in web part by default. You have to explicitly import that. So when you do that, you create a new instance of it. And each instance is related to a separate API that you want to call. So if you want to call 2 APIs, you will have 2 instances of a client. And the reason for that is that each client keeps track of the access token requests, right? So that way you cannot interchange them. And in here, when you create a new instance of a client, you have to pass 2 things. First is the service scope, which you get from a web part or extension. And then another one is the scope of your API, And that's an interesting part because this is not a URL. You cannot open this thing in browser. I mean, you could try, but you will get error. This is the scope related to the AAD app used to protect the API. If we go back to browser to AAD, in here, if I go back to Azure, you can see that the URL that we have here, which is my name.onmicrosoft.com/PnP API AAD, matches the audience which I have here. And these two have to match. Otherwise, the web part or extension that you build will not be able to obtain a token. AAD will fail saying like, yes, you will have a token, but you will not be able to use that token to communicate with this API because the audience will not match. So these two have to match. And this is not the URL of your API. This is the audience that you have set up on the AAD app that protects the API. That's an important part. And you can find it again. If you go back to function, here you go to auth. Here you go to AAD. And in here you can find the list of audiences that are set up for this AAD app. With that in place, you have now an instance of a client that you can use to call the API. And in here you can actually see that this is the URL of my API that I call. This is the function app URL, including the endpoint that I want to call in order to get orders. Right? So this is basically it. So with that in place, let's deploy the web part to SharePoint, and let's see what the experience is for a tenant admin who will get this to actually check whether he wants to approve or not the request to APIs, which we have here in package. So let's go and build the project, and we do that using gulp bundle ship, because we want to have a release version of our project that will run for a moment. It will build, bundle, it will create a package. We are done already. So with that, let's open our app catalog. And then also let's open the folder where we have the package. So now let's add the package to catalog. And we will probably get a prompt to override. Oh no, I already removed it. And that's an interesting part. Here, please go to the Service Principal Permissions Management page to approve pending permissions. Tenant admin will see this warning every single time the package that is added to catalog contains permission requests. So actually has this piece in here. Whenever this is added to package, the admin will be warned that there's a request that he or she should deal with. And an interesting bit here is that these requests are only added visible when you deploy the package. So if you would do a cancel here, you would not see the requests in there. So let's deploy it first. Deployment should be completed now. And now let us go to the tenant admin page. In here, let's refresh the page. And now we see that we have one pending approval. And this is exactly our PnP API AAD app that we had in our package. Right? And now tenant admin can say whether they want to allow scripts to access this API or not. So in our case, let's approve it.
And while you're doing that, just to reinforce on this one, you can absolutely do this in PowerShell as well. And then depending on when you're watching the video, you can actually control these permissions without having them in the SPP KT file as well. But in this case, as the video was recorded, this was the process of how to get the permissions on the other side.
Correct. And I just realized that I did not enable deployment to a tenant, so I will need to either add it to the side or I will have to
redeploy.
Redeploy, basically, yeah. I think that was this one. Yes, SPFX AAD API. Yes, I think so. Let's give it a try. So let us redeploy it, available to all sites at once. Now let's go here. Let's refresh the page. So we will now add the web part to the page to actually be able to see whether that works or not. In here, let us add a web part. PnP, and it's not there, and I have no idea how I called it. That's for bloopers, right?
Yeah, that's
orders. It's called orders. It has the most obvious name that I could pick, and I just didn't know it. Orders. It should be in here. There you go. It is there. Right, because you always overcomplicate things, and as you can see, it works. We didn't get any errors, and we actually don't show the orders in here. But if we refresh the page and reload it, in here, we will see requests that we issue, and let's filter it down to orders. So in here, you can see, and actually, I think that we have this web part placed twice on the page. Hooray for tests. But in here, you can see that we actually retrieve the orders, right? And we call actually our API. So we have all of this. We have a token that we add here. So all of this works. And all of this works. Why? Because we had a package that stated that it needs requests or it needs access to an API. Then we deployed the package to catalog, and tenant admin approved the access for the web part to this API. Because if tenant admin rejected this request, well, then we would have an access denied trying to call the API in web part. So the web part by itself would work. But then in the part where it tries to call the API, that piece would fail. Why? Because, as we said, this API, even though it lives in the same AAD, is not by default available to all scripts that run inside a tenant. This is an explicit tenant admin choice to allow API to be accessed by scripts inside a tenant. Anything you want to ask or add, Vesa?
No, not really. Yeah, so there's quite a few obviously advanced scenarios and everything else, which we already agreed that we'll not talk about them in this webcast. But we'll reference all of our documentation in the video notes, but I think it's better to go to back on the slides and close up the webcast. So thank you, Waldek. Excellent. Thank you, Waldek, one more time for the great demo on that one. Like you saw, the steps are not actually that complex. There are certain nuances which you need to understand, and how do you actually grant those permissions for within a tenant level. But in the end, the steps are relatively easy to follow. You just need to be a tenant administrator to grant those permissions, or grant permissions for your SPFX to be able to call the web API. Anything else you want to add here as a final note, Waldek?
Yes, I think that it's essential for everybody to understand this ability and what scenarios it enables, and it's really important for basically every enterprise out there to truly benefit of SPFX, right? Because if you want to, whenever you want to go beyond a web part that shows weather or stocks, well, you need to access the APIs that are just not available to anonymous. Right? So you have to take the first step. You have to do auth, and then you will be able to tap into the data that you have. And this ability makes all of that possible.
Absolutely. This is like the holy grail of SharePoint Online has been from day one. So how do we actually call in a secured way actual enterprise applications from your SharePoint Online UIs? And using the new techniques which we went through in this webcast, that's now possible, and in a secured way, which is in a relatively simple way as well. So it doesn't require any additional rocket science or additional steps anymore. But I think that's it for this one. So thank you, Waldek, for the great demo, and thank you everybody for watching. We'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you.
Bye.